What happens when an unstoppable force of calm meets an immovable object of chaos? When a man who's built his career on speaking what everyone's thinking finally sets his sights on the most explosive target in daytime television. When decades of manufactured outrage collide with the cold, unflinching truth delivered with surgical precision. What you're about to witness isn't just commentary. It's not just criticism. It's not even a roast. This is a masterclass in controlled demolition where the weapon of choice isn't volume, but devastating truth delivered with the precision of a surgeon and the calm of someone who's already won before the first word leaves his mouth. This is the story of how one man dismantled the most iconic talk show in America without raising his voice, without breaking a sweat, without giving them the satisfaction of a traditional fight. Because when you're dealing with a panel that thrives on manufactured outrage, that feeds on conflict like oxygen, that turns every conversation into a battlefield, the most dangerous thing you can do is refuse to play their game. The most lethal move is to stay calm while everything around you burns. They never saw it coming. And that's exactly what made it legendary. The morning started like any other at The View. The studio lights hummed with their familiar electric energy, casting that perfect television glow across the iconic set. Coffee mugs clinked against saucers in the green room. Makeup artists applied final touches. Producers scurried between cameras like worker bees in a hive. Headsets crackled with last-minute adjustments. Cue cards shuffled, teleprompters tested. 5 chairs sat arranged in their familiar arc, each one positioned with the precision that comes from years of the same routine. Each seat a throne. Each throne occupied by a different brand of daytime television wisdom. Each host with their role, their persona, their carefully cultivated image of speaking truth to power. Whoopi Goldberg settled into her center seat with the practiced ease of someone who'd done this dance 10,000 times before. The matriarch, the moderator, the referee. She had the power to shut down a conversation with nothing more than a raised eyebrow. That look, the signature look that said she'd seen it all, heard it all, survived it all, and wasn't impressed by any of it. She adjusted her microphone, straightened her notes, exchanged pleasantries with the crew members she'd known for years. This was her domain, her kingdom, her show. Even if the title card listed other names. The other hosts found their positions, slipping into their designated roles like actors in a play that had been running for years. The energy in the studio was electric in that manufactured way, controlled spontaneity, rehearsed authenticity, a paradox that made The View what it was. Stage managers counted down. Cameras went live. The familiar theme music played. Another episode began just like all the others. Or so they thought. But somewhere miles away from that studio, in a completely different building, on a completely different show, Tyrus was having his own conversation. Not with them, not to them, not even about them at first. Just speaking his mind the way he always did, with that unbothered heavyweight champion energy that made everything sound like he was ordering lunch while simultaneously ending careers. He sat in his chair with a casual authority that can't be taught or faked. The posture of someone who's been in the ring, who's faced real adversity, who's built everything from the ground up, and doesn't need anyone's approval to know his own worth. His co-hosts chatted around him. The conversation flowed naturally, organically, the way real discussions do when people aren't performing for effect. And then someone mentioned The View. It was innocent enough. A passing reference, a throwaway comment, the kind of thing that usually leads nowhere. But with Tyrus, you could never quite tell. That's what made him dangerous. He had a way of making surgical strikes feel like casual observations. The ability to dismantle entire worldviews while sounding like he was discussing the weather. Those who knew him, really knew him, recognized the slight shift in his energy, the barely perceptible change in his tone, the way his eyes focused just a little differently. The warning signs were there for anyone paying attention. This wasn't going to be just another hot take. This was going to be something else entirely. The View, he said, his voice carrying that signature low-key rumble that somehow conveyed more authority than 1,000 shouting matches ever could. The way he said it, those 2 words carried weight. History, observation, judgment. The studio around him seemed to lean in slightly. His co-host sensed something. The crew behind the cameras paused in their work. Even the air felt different, charged with anticipation. Little did anyone know, this calm beginning was about to become the spark for one of the most talked-about roasts in recent television history. Not because of what would happen in person, but because of how devastating truth sounds when delivered without malice, without anger, without any of the theatrical tools the View typically used to control the narrative. Because here's the thing about confronting chaos. You don't meet it with more chaos. You don't fight fire with fire. You don't engage on their terms. You meet it with cold, calculated calm. You let them shout while you speak. You let them perform while you observe. You let them chase drama while you deliver truth. And nobody, absolutely nobody, did calm quite like Tyrus. The mechanism was simple but brutal in its effectiveness. While the View was busy doing its daily dance of interruptions and contradictions, building their kingdom of controlled chaos, Tyrus was across town dismantling their entire operation with the surgical precision of someone who'd been watching this circus for far too long and finally decided to say what everyone else was thinking. "You know what the View needs?" he asked. And there it was. The setup. Clean, simple, devastating in its restraint. A question that sounded genuine, but was in fact a loaded weapon. His co-hosts waited. The audience waited. The internet, though it didn't know it yet, was about to collectively hold its breath. They don't need to find Trump supporters. The pause was deliberate. Perfect. The silence stretched just long enough to build tension, to create space for what came next. They need to fire their race baiters. The words hung in the air like a truth bomb with a delayed fuse. Not shouted, not screamed, not delivered with theatrical outrage or performative anger. Stated with the kind of matter-of-fact delivery you'd use to point out that water is wet, the sky is blue, or that the emperor, despite everyone's insistence to the contrary, isn't actually wearing any clothes. But here's where it got really interesting, because Tyrus wasn't done. He was just getting started building his case brick by brick. Each one laid with the meticulous care of someone who knew exactly what he was constructing. A master architect demolishing a house of cards. "You've had people on there before," he continued, his tone never wavering from that dangerous calm. The kind of calm that's more threatening than any amount of yelling. "You had McCain on there. You've had people who tried to bring different perspectives, different viewpoints, different voices." Another pause. Let it breathe. Let the audience connect the dots themselves. And you ran them off. The observation cut deeper than any shouting match ever could, because it was trifiably, undeniably, painfully true. And when you're dealing with truth, volume becomes irrelevant. Theatrics become unnecessary. You just state the facts and let them do the heavy lifting. "So, the racist ones who want to stick to this," he said. And now the gloves were coming off. Still delivered with that same unbothered energy. Still sounding like he was discussing the weather. Whoopi and Sonny and what's her name? Bess Midler. The nickname landed with comedic precision. Not cruel, but cutting. Not mean, but accurate. The kind of observation that makes people laugh and wince at the same time, because it's too true to dismiss, but too harsh to fully embrace. Somewhere in that View studio, you could almost feel the seismic shift. Not that they were there to hear it. Not that it mattered in that moment, because Tyrus wasn't talking to them. He was talking about them. And somehow that was infinitely more devastating. The beauty of it was in what he didn't do. He didn't yell. He didn't curse. He didn't engage in a theatrical outrage that the View ran on like fossil fuel. He didn't perform. He didn't posture. He didn't pretend. He just pointed out the obvious, spoke the unspeakable, named the unnamed, and let gravity do the rest. The weird thing about the View, he added with that trademark dry humor, the delivery so deadpan it took a second for the punchline to register, was that Dylan Melanie was the most feminine person there. Boom. Not a shout, not a scream. Not a theatrical delivery designed for applause. Just an observation delivered with a kind of comedic timing that makes people spit out their coffee and scramble for the replay button. The room erupted in laughter, not mean-spirited cackling, but the kind of genuine, surprised laughter that comes from hearing something so unexpected, yet so perfectly observed that you can't help but react. Back at the View studio, business continued as usual. They had no idea what was coming. How could they? They were too busy being exactly what Tyrus had just described at that very moment. 5 voices trying to outshout each other. Each one convinced they held the moral high ground while standing in a valley of their own contradictions. Whoopi gesticulated with a commanding presence she'd cultivated over decades. The others nodded, agreed, disagreed, interrupted each other with the practiced choreography of people who turned debate into a contact sport. The cameras captured it all. The audience reacted on cue. The producers monitored from the control room. Just another day at the View, but the clock was ticking. The internet was already moving. Social media algorithms had picked up the signal. Clips were being shared. Screenshots were being taken. Tyrus's words were spreading like wildfire through a dry forest, catching on every branch of social media, growing hotter with each share, each retweet, each comment. "It's only in America," Tyrus continued, now hitting his stride, building momentum with each sentence. "Can a black person sit on a TV show getting paid millions of dollars to have the floor, to interrupt people, to speak freely without consequence?" He leaned into the irony with the precision of a surgeon making an incision. Every word chosen carefully, every phrase designed for maximum impact. And then compare their life to Iran, where interrupting and speaking in public would have led to a stoning. The ignorance of it. The sheer, breathtaking ignorance. The logic was unassailable, the delivery impeccable, the effect absolutely devastating. This wasn't a roast. This was an autopsy. And Tyrus was calmly pointing out every cause of death, while the patient insisted it was still alive and thriving. "You live in a country where you might feel a certain way," he said, building to something bigger, more profound. "But here's the one thing about America that makes it different from anywhere else. You have an opportunity. A real opportunity. A chance to succeed, to grow, to build something." He paused, letting the words land. Even if you're as dumb as, he didn't need to finish the sentence. Everyone knew what he meant. Everyone could fill in the blank. The unsaid words hung in the air more powerfully than anything he could have actually stated. The escalation was happening, but not in the way the View would recognize or know how to counter. There were no raised voices, no dramatic gestures, no theatrical staging. Just truth piling on top of truth, each one heavier than the last until the weight became impossible to ignore, impossible to dismiss, impossible to deflect. "Hire them and bring people in," Tyrus continued. Now, even as he tore down the existing structure, he was offering solutions. Not just destroying, but showing a better way. Maybe you could get McCain to come back. She was a Republican, but every show and every break, she was nearly in tears because she was being attacked. Let that image sink in. Let people visualize it. Not debated, not disagreed with, but attacked. The picture he painted was vivid and dominant, a woman driven to tears. Not by robust debate, but by relentless bullying. A panel so convinced of their righteousness that they couldn't see their own cruelty. So wrapped up in their moral superiority that they'd become the very thing they claimed to oppose. "So the problem is," Tyrus said, his voice taking on an even more serious tone, still calm, but heavy with the gravity of the point he was making, "you have to go after the racist people. And if the CEO goes, you know what? I'm not going. To allow a woman on my show or a man that will go after white America and talk about them like dogs. That doesn't represent our ideals or values for anyone and gets rid of those people. This will clear up real quick." The solution was simple, obvious, even apply the same standards equally. Treat racism as racism regardless of who's expressing it. Hold everyone to the same ethical bar. And it was absolutely impossible for the View to accept because it would require looking in a mirror they'd been avoiding for years. Acknowledging patterns they'd spent years denying. Admitting flaws they'd spent careers insisting didn't exist. "You have to actually look in the mirror and clean up your own backyard," Tyrus said, driving the point home with the relentlessness of someone who knew he right and didn't need anyone's validation to prove it. "Get the racist people out," Tyrus said, his voice calm, his words cutting through the noise like a hot knife through butter. "That's who you allowed in. You allowed black racists on TV who could just go all day and say anything they want about white people and nobody stops them. The double standard laid bare, the hypocrisy exposed, the contradiction impossible to ignore." His words echoed across the internet, spreading through social media feeds, piercing into living rooms across America. People who'd been thinking the exact same thing for years suddenly had a voice. And that voice was delivered with the calm authority of someone who refused to be shouted down, refused to be intimidated, and refused to back down from truth simply because it was uncomfortable. Back at the View studio, the first tremors of the earthquake were starting to reach the surface. Producers glanced at their phones between segments, their faces registering confusion, then concern, and then something approaching panic. Social media managers watched in real time as Tyrus's commentary went viral. The numbers climbing exponentially, the panic was setting in, but slowly, like water seeping through a crack that would eventually become a flood. Whoopi, veteran of 1,000 controversies, survivor of countless storms, sensed something. That sixth sense that comes from decades in the public eye. From navigating countless scandals, from reading the temperature of public opinion before it becomes obvious to everyone else. Something was different about today. The energy had shifted in a way she couldn't quite identify, but she definitely felt it. But the show went on. It always did. That was the rule. The cardinal rule of live television. No matter what's happening outside, the show continues inside. The thing about The View is that it's built on a foundation of performative outrage. Every episode follows the same formula, the same predictable pattern. Find a controversy, stake out positions, interrupt each other until commercial break, return from commercial, repeat the cycle. It's less a discussion and more a verbal WWE match, except with more coffee, fewer coherent thoughts, and everyone's somehow convinced they're doing important work. And Tyrus had just pointed out that the emperor wasn't wearing clothes, that the whole operation was built on shifting sand, that the moral authority they claimed was nothing more than selective outrage and convenient amnesia. "You have an opportunity tomorrow," he said, now making it personal. "They won't fire you over that. You're too big, too established, too protected by the institution. You'll have an opportunity tomorrow to come on and fix it, to address what you said, to clarify, to apologize, to make it right." Pause. Let the anticipation build. Will she? Another pause. Shorter this time. A rhetorical question becoming a statement. She won't. The prophecy was delivered with the confidence of someone who'd seen this movie before, knew exactly how it ended, understood the patterns, recognized the psychology, predicted the response before it happened. But that's the thing about this country. Black, white, gay, straight, short, tall, rich, poor. Everyone's going to get hit with something. Everyone's going to face criticism. Everyone's going to encounter opposition. But the beauty about this country is, Tyrus continued, building to the finish, there's always an opportunity for you to better yourself, to grow, to change, to acknowledge your mistakes and become something better. And then the final nail. The coup de grace. The moment everyone would remember. "So shame on you, Whoopi," he said. "Play the black card somewhere else, because that don't work here in America." Boom. Mic drop. Career ended. Except not really, because Whoopi wasn't going anywhere, and Tyrus knew it. That was part of the brilliance of his approach. He wasn't trying to cancel anyone. He wasn't calling for boycotts or demanding resignations. He was just holding up a mirror and forcing them to look at their own reflection. Forcing America to look at what this show had become. The irony was palpable. Thick enough to cut with a knife. A show that claimed to speak truth to power couldn't handle having truth spoken about it. A panel that demanded accountability from everyone else recoiled at the suggestion they might need to be accountable themselves. Women who made careers out of calling out double standards couldn't see the massive double standard they'd created. And lo and behold, Tyrus continued with that dry humor that made everything funnier, that deadpan delivery that turned observation into comedy gold. They forgot that there's a lot of people at home, white people at home during the day, that aren't watching your show anymore. The ratings argument. The business case. The undeniable reality that their approach wasn't just morally questionable, it was commercially failing. "So just clean it up," Tyrus said. "It's that simple. Just clean it up. Practical, direct, impossible to misunderstand."